Yeah, our bullseye is really training and equipping adults who care for kids who've experienced chronic and complex trauma. And we may have shared this together when we were in Atlanta. Right now, pre-pandemic, the numbers were over half of the children in the world have experienced some type of complex trauma or chronic trauma in the last year. And that's over a billion children.
Welcome back to the Digital Ministry Podcast. I'm your host, Nick, and as always, the Digital Ministry Podcast is brought to you by Media Impact International. So I want to thank our friends at MII for making all this possible. And I also want to thank Rob Hall for being here today. Rob, you are the president of Trauma Free World, and I'm excited to hear a little bit more about that and what you do in technology and in your organization and in this space. So thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the invite. Excited to talk a bit about Trauma Free World, but especially what we're doing in AI and, how that's kind of reinvigorated us, kind of even reinvented a little bit about what we're doing. So I'm excited to have the conversation.
And the three people that have listened to these past episodes before will realize that I just kind of flubbed that intro a little bit because, and we were talking about this a little bit, like you and I don't know each other well. And so I'm here to learn today. I kind of got lost there. I was like, I'm not even really sure, like, is Trauma Free World a ministry? Like we were together recently at a ministry conversation, but I've got a lot to learn. I did like a little prep work, but not to where my intro is smooth.
Well, it's an interesting thing. I'll even talk about that a little bit. We're born out of an organization, a ministry called Back to Back Ministries that does global orphan care, right? Orphan and vulnerable children. But for a number of reasons, we were separated from, they still sort of own us. But part of that was being able to work with non-ministry focused places, right? Public schools, governments, in countries necessarily that wouldn't really be really excited about a ministry, those kind of things. So publicly facing, we consider ourselves primarily an organization, a nonprofit or an NGO, depending on what part of the world you're in. But our DNA, the heart of the people who make this thing go, we're all Jesus followers, and that's what drives us to do the work.
That's awesome. I've been having this conversation. You know how you get into like these circles in your life where it's like, oh, that same thing keeps coming up a little bit, The last several weeks, I've touched on these passages in the Bible where Jesus is basically telling his disciples, whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me. Like that has come up half a dozen times in the last 2 weeks in different conversations with different people, completely unrelated.
Yeah.
So I'm always like, the Lord's trying to tell me something here. But that's what I think of when I think of the work that you're doing. I mean, you're really like seeking to engage and support people that have dealt with really difficult, challenging circumstances in their lives.
Yeah, our bullseye is really training and equipping adults who care for kids who've experienced chronic and complex trauma. And we may have shared this together when we were in Atlanta. Right now, pre-pandemic, the numbers were over half of the children in the world have experienced some type of complex trauma or chronic trauma in the last year. And that's over a billion children. Right. And so we also know that the key to that is a caring, loving adult in the life of that child. Right. And it's such an enormous issue, enormous problem. How do you mobilize hundreds of millions of adults, not just who want to care and love kids, but with some specific skills around how do I engage with kids who've experienced trauma? Because it affects them in a different way than a kind of a normal, healthy child. And so that's been the key for us. And really this AI and large language model approach that we've stepped into pretty aggressively is part of that. Scaling what has been traditionally known and researched as helpful, but unable to scale to meet the just enormous needs just of the child population. And so that's where almost by accident, we stepped into this and we're like, oh, this is the ramifications of large language models and other AI tools that we're beginning to poke at. We actually now there is it feels real that we can make a difference in the lives of a billion kids.
Wow. That's amazing. And what a meaningful difference. So give me a little bit more context. So you had some specific language around trauma, which I can't repeat. I just can't remember, but it struck me is we're not talking about just like, I don't know, I got spanked as a kid and I didn't, I didn't
Yeah.
like it,
Yeah.
like
Right.
there's a level of trauma that you are dealing with that you're trying to help people understand, what you might say. You might try to engage a kid in one way who, without experiencing that trauma, that engagement would be received as like loving and kind and good. But coming from this traumatic background, that same engagement delivered in the same way might be painful, harmful. Like,
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
that, give me
Yeah.
a little bit more context about
Sure.
what
Sure.
some of the challenges that you guys are trying to address,
Yeah.
because what I want to talk about is like, how does that complexity get handled
Yeah.
in some of these tools that you're building? So, but I
Right.
want to understand the complexity
Yeah.
first.
Excellent questions. So quick crash course right there. We kind of break it down, and most folks who work in this realm would pretty much agree. There's acute trauma, which is a one-time event, a car accident, an earthquake, a tornado, right? That's an acute trauma. There's some specific ways to deal with that, right? Usually you should be talking about that trauma within 48 hours, right? So, in the US, for example, if there's a school shooting or a death, like someone dies in a car accident, like counselors descend on that school because we know for brain development that talking about that trauma within the first 48 hours, an acute trauma like that, works to prevent it having a long-term effect.
Hmm.
But the kind of trauma that we're really focused on is much more chronic and then complex developmental. Chronic just means what it sounds like. It's ongoing, right? It's over time. It could be community violence, abuse, neglect, living in a household where there's domestic violence or drug abuse, refugeeism around the world, right? These are ongoing chronic traumas, right? And then a subset of that is complex developmental trauma. That's the same kind of chronic trauma, but it's happening to children basically under 5 years old. And the
Oh,
reason that that's called complex developmental trauma is because that's when the growth, not just physically, but in a child's brain is just, hyperdrive, right? And trauma interrupts that. So it actually interrupts brain development and physical development in a way for children under 5 than it doesn't necessarily in the same way that chronic trauma might affect a child older than 5 or 6 years old. So,
huh. Is this where you get, some people that are like, I don't remember my childhood? Like your brain's just kind of mapped
yeah,
that
sure.
around that to where,
Yeah.
like, I don't want to go
Yeah.
back there.
Right. Sure. That is one, that is a common result of trauma. And that's even in adults, right? It's not just children.
Right.
Right. But especially in children, not only those kind of things, but it really does affect your brain, your body, your biology, your behavior, your relationships, right? That kind of trauma, if you imagine, for instance, growing up in a household where there's abuse,
Hmm.
right? And so your behavior is going to be affected by that. How you get attention, avoid attention, how you interact with authority figures and don't interact with authority figures, right? That plays out for the rest of your life unless there's some intervention, right? The way that you trust or don't a teacher, the way that you interact with someone in an after school program or your Sunday school class or whatever it might be. You've learned defense and coping mechanisms based on that experience when you were a kid, and it affects now your relationships, your attachment, the other things that are happening for the rest of your life. And the reason Trauma Free World is really focused in on childhood trauma is you get as far upstream in intervention as possible, right? There's great work being done with adults, but that's 20 some years on. Can we enter into the life of kids earlier in life so that we can begin to offset some of those painful realities earlier in their development and as they grow?
And you threw out, there's 1 billion kids that
Yeah.
have experienced this kind of trauma.
Yeah, that's
Um,
a pre-pandemic number. Yeah. More
yeah,
than half of the children on earth.
yeah, that is crazy. I mean, there's 8 something billion people,
Right.
so I'm sitting here trying to think of how to ask this in a way that doesn't
Yeah.
sound
Fire
like
away.
crass, but
Yeah.
what's the goal? The goal, we're not trying to fix anything here. Is this just like loving engagement, coping? Like what is it that you're trying to help deliver through this training?
Sure. Sure. Well, What we're really trying to deliver, especially in the large language model AI side of things, are right on time resources
Hmm.
in a person's first language on any device for free to the end user. And so that's the goal for what we want to deliver. The goal in receiving that is you would increasingly allow an adult who finds themselves in closest proximity to a child who's experienced trauma having the skill they need or the information they need to intervene right away. Right. So
Okay.
so
So
that's
it
so
is
that's
like
the goal is like, hey, I can pick up my phone. It's the world's greatest trauma coach in your pocket. Right.
okay,
You pick it
right.
up, you talk to it, it's in your language, and you say, hey, I've got a new a foster child in my home. He comes from this background and he won't sleep at night. How do I help him go to sleep at night? And you now have this generative conversational, you know,
Yeah.
interaction with
Yeah.
with an AI chatbot,
Yeah.
and it's driven by, some of the greatest training content on the planet, and it begins to talk to you about what you can do in that moment to help the child in your care.
I'm thinking about teachers as well. Like I would imagine a
Yeah.
foster parent would already be there, like with anticipate that maybe.
Yep.
But a teacher might be surprised by
Yeah.
this kid that's like, oh, I'm realizing now in this moment, halfway through the school year, I've got like chronic trauma in this kid's life that
Yeah.
now but I'm interacting with him every day. So it's like rapid deployment of training and resource for that teacher.
Yeah,
Is
you're
that
speaking my language. My previous career, my doctoral degree is actually in education, right? So
okay?
I worked in education, and you're 100% on, right? They are secondary caregivers. Their primary role
Okay.
is not to directly care for kids who have trauma, but in order to deliver their primary role to educate kids, they need to understand the complexities of the kids individually in their room. Right.
Mm,
So having a tool like this allows a teacher during a break or they're doing lesson plans or whatever it is to say, hey, I've got a new child in my classroom, or I just discovered. So how can I help them stay focused in class? Right. And it's not just in general. We talked about this difference between kids who may not have this background, right? More traditional, here's a perfect example, Nick.
sure.
Right. A common behavioral intervention in the classroom is isolation, right? Go in the hallway, sit in the corner, whatever that might be, right? Social isolation. That's the worst possible intervention for a kid who's experienced trauma because breaking relationship only serves to reinforce the things that they've learned about themselves as the result of trauma. It's actually most important to keep relational connection, right? So a common behavioral intervention in teachers is isolation, and it's the worst possible thing you can do for a kid from trauma. So having a coach in your pocket, having an AI resource that's able to speak to a teacher about education and give them practical strategy is an exact case study for how an AI in the moment can give that kind of feedback as compared to, I think I took a training online about this sometime over the summer and I really can't remember what it
Right.
is.
Yeah.
Right? It's right now in the moment, and it allows them to engage a student or equally as a foster parent, someone they're caring for in that moment, personalized to the situation they're facing.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah. I can imagine my brother's great at this. Like he can read stuff and retain it and then just apply it later. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
he's brilliant. I'm
Yep.
not like,
Me neither.
I kind of know Spanish. It gets really
Okay.
good if I'm in South America for like a week or two, and then I'm
Right.
great. But
Right.
like I meet somebody, in the middle of the day and I can't recall like, common greetings or whatever.
Right.
People that have gone through some of that trauma engagement training,
Yep.
being able to access it immediately, it makes perfect sense to me, and
Yeah.
and step me through that process. So is that just one more marketing question I'm thinking about in a marketing context? Like,
Sure.
are you building and presenting these tools like to like a target persona, or like how are you getting these tools out in front of people that can use them?
Yeah. Great question. Right. There's a million people who have a million great ideas, but the key to those ideas is actually distribution.
Hmm.
Right. How do you get it in people's hands? Right. So for us, we've decided on a business to business
Okay.
plan, right?
Yeah.
A structure, right? So we're not business to consumer. So we're not going to flood people's Facebook pages and Instagrams with try our tool, right?
Right.
So Trauma Free World is built in alliance. It's a growing alliance. That's what brought me to Atlanta, where we met, was
Yeah.
kind of the fruit of some of those relationships already. So we want to be able to leverage the trust that other organizations have built with their people by giving those organizations the tools to distribute to their people, right?
Okay.
So that's really our strategy. How do we get it into the hands of people? We find foster care agencies, we find nonprofits working in the Middle East, we find Boys and Girls Club of America. We find these organizations that are already working with those populations, and we say, how can we build a tool that meets your needs as you anticipate that audience, and then distribute it through them to the end user.
And you've got some incredible network of supporters, board members, people that are really have gotten behind this idea, which I was I don't want to name any names. I'm not supposed to.
Yeah, that's all right.
But I was encouraged to hear how kind of your vision has caught on with some people that have some of those significant relationships that can push those out on a broad scale. So
yeah, it feels like name dropping, and I don't want it to be. It's more along the lines of, and quite honestly, Nick, I know the audience we're speaking to. It's been relatively miraculous. By the way, that's my dog in the background.
Yeah.
It's been relatively Jesus level miraculous. We should not be talking to the people we're talking to. They should not be talking to us. I'm in a spare bedroom in Loveland, Ohio, right? I'm just a guy.
Right.
And we had our first gathering almost exactly a year ago around this idea at the UN. It wasn't a UN event, but we had a colleague who just retired. He was a bigwig for public-private partnerships at the United Nations. And he's just been on it. He's like, this idea has changed the way that I think about putting trauma resources in the hands of people. So from Will at the UN, whether it's been the person who convened us in Atlanta, Arthur Blank Foundation, Dave Thomas Foundation, Art Taylor, Daniel Lee at Aura Health, who's doing amazing things in mental health. I'm like, where did these people come from? Greg Simpson, Greg Simpson, the former chief technology officer at General Electric and Synchrony Financial, he lives around the corner. and we had breakfast, and he's like, I love this idea. Can I help you? So he's leading our tech team, retired chief technology officer at General Electric. And I'm like, Jesus is weaving together this team, and the results of that, the momentum of that has been, as I said, it totally Jesus doing the work, and we're just holding on for dear life.
I mean, just a side note, I'm always impressed and encouraged by people like some of those that you mentioned who have used their position of influence and resource in order to really make meaningful change and do good in people's lives, So I've been on both the industry and the ministry side, and I don't know, thankful for that type of stewardship, So I'm glad that you guys you have that wind in your sails, and you've got some really strong backers and support on your team.
Yeah.
So
because
we're looking forward to seeing where this all goes. So very complex issues. I've done a little bit of stuff around, AI development in a ministry context. And at least early on, a lot of these language models had a really hard time distinguishing between the spiritual conversations and what I might just otherwise call normal conversations, So the word ministry, for example, it could be the ministry of energy, or it could be ministry of the gospel to people. So, that's a very basic, simplistic example, but you're dealing with some really complex stuff. How have you approached training these models to where you get kind of a high quality result and not something that could potentially be damaging? And correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it seems like the stakes are high with the stuff that you're building.
Yeah. Yes and no. And I don't want to minimize them. Right. So the stakes are less high because we have an adult on the other end who's filtering that information before it gets directly to a child. Right. So if you compare that to a large language model, this is another reason why we think that working with kids is a good first step. If we were working with adults, right, then you get into all kinds of other issues like, hey, I'm going to help you as if I were your therapist or coach. I'm going to help you directly. All kinds of potential landmines there.
Right.
If we were working directly with kids, that would be that'd be a whole different thing, right? So by working with adults, we've mitigated a little bit of of that risk.
Was that intentional, or did you just realize
Yes.
that?
No, that was
All right.
that was intentional. I mean, it was a good place for us because Trauma Free World works primarily with kids, but many of our alliance partners, this alliance that I was talking about, they don't specialize in children,
Sure.
right? They might do disaster relief or other things, but we've agreed to focus on this as our first use case because of kind of this risk mitigation of having a filter between the AI conversation and the intended beneficiary, which is
Yeah.
kids, right?
Well, I
So
think
that
it's
helps us. And then training the AI model, right, through prompt engineering, other persona building. We've begun to feel really confident about what it shouldn't answer and what it should, right? So
give me an example of that.
well, so early on when it was just our team, when we first built our first persona, we're like, let's try to break it. Let's see what it shouldn't answer, what it should answer. And so a couple of examples were I went with a school route and I said, hey, I'm a teacher and I have a student who's talking about bringing guns to school.
Okay.
Right? What should I do about that? Well, vanilla ChatGPT without any training was like, well, have you talked to the student? What about saying this? And I'm like, wrong answer.
Okay.
Right? The right answer is we don't talk about this. You need to go to the police and an administrator, right? So training through prompt engineering, training that persona to say, oh, I'm an expert in trauma training, but I'm not an expert in this. Therefore, you need to find some other resources, right? Suicide is another one of those, right? If you're working with kids and, hey, I have a child who is talking about suicide, how can I help them? We don't, again, gently in conversation, you train you through prompt engineering. Oh my gosh, that's a serious thing. It's got to be really difficult for you. That's not something I'm an expert in. 988 in the United States or 911, you should call them immediately. They'll be able to help you. So being able to prompt engineer around what you shouldn't even talk about then allows us to go on a deeper dive about how do we prompt engineer around what we should talk about. Okay. And that's really the stage we are right now is prompt engineering the AI to anticipate, particular kinds of situations or the audience that it's talking to.
And remind me again, what are you guys building on?
So we're building on ChatGPT in an Azure environment. So, and right now it's just kind of basic ChatGPT. So we haven't fed it any documentation. We haven't done any RAG, any of those things, just in our early testing. And maybe some of your listeners will enjoy this conversation. We've had internal arguments about this, right? Like, hey, shouldn't we build
we always
a library?
like the juicy internal argument conversation on the podcast. Yeah.
Should we build a library and use RAG, or should we just use ChatGPT? Well, RAG's super expensive, right? And building a library, what gets into the library, right? The other was translation, Nick, was partners is early on has been SIL, right? On the translation side. And so we had this internal argument about, do we need translation or can we rely on ChatGPT for the translation? And because the translation itself services cost money, we said, let's just do it without. And Greg Simpson was, I think for the major languages, we don't need translation, right? We can just rely on the built-in translation. And it turns out, at least for the major languages, that's proven to be the case, that we can rely on ChatGPT for the linguistic part. Quick story. Can I tell you a quick story?
Yeah, please.
So we decided we wanted to launch just a really small user test in Lebanon, right? Arabic speaking, Middle Eastern persona, just 4 or 5 users. We're like, will this work? Will it speak Arabic? Will it understand Arabic? Whatever. So we launched it. We had 5 users and it was a ministry in the Middle East. And they're like, hey, the language was great. Like, no problems. And so we're like, all right. That's fantastic. They said, but here's the problem. When we asked it to help us, it just assumed because we were from the Middle East that they wanted the Quran. So ChatGPT automatically culturally thought, oh, this is a Middle Eastern population. And so I'm just going to start answering with stuff from the Quran. So it was a great reminder. We kind of knew that we didn't do any like cultural prompt engineering or persona building.
Sure.
But we never anticipated that would be it. And so like, we can't use this because we're a Christian ministry.
Right.
So it answered one question for us and opened up an entire Pandora's box about, wow, this is talk about complex. How do you begin to build personas around that, the
Yeah.
different cultural contexts throughout the Middle East? So anyway, that's kind of the language and the cultural context back and forth. It's one thing for the words to sound right. It's a whole nother thing for the cultural context to be right.
Come on, ChatGPT. Like, the Middle East is the birthplace of Christianity. Like, why would we make
Right.
that assumption? That is fascinating. I love everything about this. So what phase, like, is this released or what?
Now, so
Like,
we
what
did our
phase are you in?
initial pilot back in March, kind of our
Okay.
MVP version back in March. We ran a pilot with about 200 users.
Mm-hmm.
We've been raising some cash over the summer. We want to take it from a web-based app to a native mobile app, right?
Okay.
But we've needed to do some testing along those lines. So we've been following a lean innovation protocol in terms of our innovation strategy. And so we're about to start building the native mobile app, but we're doing a couple of additional pilot projects with our MVP version to continue learning. And by the time the native mobile apps are built in the spring, we'll do some demonstration projects. So it won't be released to the public, but we'll have some 2 or 3 month long demonstration projects so that we can measure some additional app usage stats, quality control, those kind of things. And then if all of that goes well, then we'll move into a wider release.
And you've got like a stable of beta testers, I'm sure, that are
Yeah.
like using this. So the thing about working with adults that are working with kids that I love, that I just wanted to mention earlier, was like, it really builds a partnership, so
Mm-hmm.
how much like feedback or input are you taking from some of those people that are helping you with the build?
Well, right now it's almost all feedback from them, right? We've got the idea, we've built the structure, but to make it a viable product, the end user, it's just like any tech startup. The end user has to be able to give feedback about use case, right?
Yeah.
So for us, there's a constant learning feedback, right? So pre and post testing with our MVP, pre and post testing with our current pilots, including focus groups. We want to hear what the end user thinks of the product, what features they would like to see built on as we build, right? The quality of the interaction, right? The feedback so far has been, even by our standards, has been surprisingly good, even in our MVP version. And so we're confident in the nuts and bolts. And now it's what kind of features, add-ons do end users really want to see? And then the language cultural adaptation, right? So even in the US, for example, right? What about the Latino population or a particularly urban population that would be different than, suburban white foster care parent, right?
Oh,
Are
that's
there
interesting.
particular language nuances, cultural nuances, like doulas? We're talking to a group of
Yeah.
doulas in Atlanta, right, who work as birth coaches, right,
Yeah.
for primarily African American urban moms, right? That's a whole different cultural adaptation, but the same kind of concept, right? Is
Right.
how do I speak a language in a culture, even if it's English, but a subculture? How do we do that so it's easily received by the listener? So it doesn't sound like me, right? Or it doesn't sound like,
Sure.
just your typical trainer from a nonprofit. It sounds like somebody who's from my neighborhood
Right.
who I can trust, right? And so there's a lot to learn about who that trusted persona is in those neighborhoods, in those cultures. Is it a young woman? Is it an auntie? Right? What does it sound like? What does it look
Yeah.
like? What is the voice tone like? Right? These are the ways that users will indicate to us that's something that I would use.
Well, yeah, I mean, tone's part of it, but the context there is deep.
Right? Right.
That is interesting.
But
How big?
here's the beauty, Nick,
Yeah.
right? Is if you build the structure, we know, from large language models, cloning that structure and then building a new persona on that structure isn't that technically difficult, right? I mean, a new
Right. Yeah.
persona,
Yeah.
right? You just create a new large language model, new persona that takes the feedback of this audience, and now You roll that out through that trusted partner, that trusted NGO that they're working with, and they're like, oh, this sounds like us. It talks like us. It understands our cultural context. And lo and behold, the nonprofit down the street is giving me the thumbs up on it.
That's
Right? It's
amazing.
easy to replicate.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. When this is launched and rolled out, how do you intend to track kind of user engagement and understand, like, is this having the intended impact? And there's a user feedback loop, but then there's also like a quantitative element to it. Like
Yeah.
how widespread is this?
Yeah. So obviously all the back end data that you can get from Azure or from the tech usage, right? How many minutes, how long is a conversation, right? We can, in the aggregate, we can get data back. What are the key words or subjects that have been talked about, right? Are there particular areas that are talked about more than others? So there's all that kind of back end data. Are there, what areas of the world or parts of the city, or what are the demographics of the user as they've created an account or logged on, right? You can get all of that back end data just built into the interaction between the app. But there's also through research or demonstration projects, right? So our research partner is the Ohio State University College of Social Work, right?
Okay.
So we can do some really in-depth work through them, right? Through their research, as well as our own demonstration projects, right? Hey, this is not just pick it up and use it. We actually want to learn from a particular demonstration project. So we can get kind of the general feedback from use, and then we can have either some really in-depth university research and or some demonstration project research where we have specific pre and post, testing that we want to learn from the user experience.
And with a background in kind of course development and distribution, that's really a one-way conversation.
Yeah.
It might be a two-way conversation, but it's a slow feedback loop.
Yeah.
What you're talking about with this AI model is like instant feedback. Like,
Yes.
how is your organization? Well, I think I'm making some assumptions here,
Okay.
but like this is super simplistic, so tell me if I'm wrong, but like you're taking kind of a foundation of course development, you're feeding it into a language model, you're delivering it like in real time, on time to these people that are working with kids dealing with trauma. But then there's also, now with the AI, you're getting an instant feedback that's then informing the model continually, or no?
That's our hope. Yes.
Yeah. And so, like, what implication does that have for your organization? Like, that's a huge shift in just I'm struggling to try to, like, if and it's true that you started with like course development, right? So like that's the genesis of Trauma Free World.
Correct. Yes.
So you've got like expertise, you're delivering material, but now as much as you're putting out, you're also receiving back. Like, yes, a little bit of it's tweaking and feedback, but like all of those contextual things that we were talking about, all the different personas, like how is your organization going to kind of digest and metabolize all of that information that's now coming back to you through this tool?
That's a great question, Nick. If you have any ideas for us, that would be fantastic.
Well, it's just occurring to me like here, which is why
Yeah.
I'm having trouble like putting it into
Yeah.
words, but I can't
So
imagine what that shift was going to be like.
yeah. So I don't know if this is a direct answer to the question. Conceptually, structurally, there's a couple ways. One is, the alliance that we're building with other organization is filled with subject matter experts,
Okay.
right? And they have by extension their own connections to other subject matter experts, right? So having an audit, for lack of a better term, right, of what are the answers, right? What are the questions being asked? What are the answers, right? So we're not going to be able to screen all of the data that's coming back to us, but we can audit that data and begin to learn what we can from it. So there's the data and analysis side, which is just reams of data, right? That's more the research data analysis side. And there's the subject matter expert side, which is basically auditing conversations, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the way that we hope to be able to help that is there hasn't been, or we're unaware of any unifying taxonomy in the trauma training world, right? So if you think of education, there's taxonomies that help you organize content, right?
Sure.
But there isn't any unifying taxonomy that we know of that all these training organizations can kind of use as a infrastructure. So one way we hope to be able to audit more effectively, filter data more effectively, is to tag, once we build a library, is to tag that library with the taxonomy so that we can begin to make sense of what is this just giant flood of information. How can we use AI through a taxonomy to help us begin to filter that out so that we can audit it in a smart way, so that we can look at the data in a particular way instead of just a field of data that doesn't really make any sense to us. So theoretically, that's what we're hoping for.
Yeah.
We're early enough in the stage that we haven't had to cross that bridge yet. But like I said, if you got any ideas, I'd love them.
Well, sharing that across the alliance must be appealing to the different members of that group too, right? I mean, because now they start to get informed.
Yeah, I think so. I was on a call today. I'll give you an interesting example. So I was on a call today with a potential distribution partner. Love them. Family Match is who they are, and they usually I don't know if you know about Family Match.
No, I don't.
But they have some engineers from Match.com that came over to work with them.
Okay.
And they match foster kids with foster families using a similar structure as Match.com.
Oh, that's
so
cool.
instead of just hey, you have a family and I have a kid, good luck, right? They have all of these parameters, right? And I love them. And Thea Ramirez, I was on a call with her today. She's amazing. And so she told me that here's an instance. They've partnered with Google to figure out where on maps potential families live, right? So they're using this mapping technology to say, how do we get people in the right geographical areas and closest to school? Like this whole thing. It was just like, Thea, you're amazing, right? But this is a way where she's been able to take a ton of information, take a sliver of that information, and make that data really practically useful in terms of finding actually we have all these relational matches, but what about close to a school? Or what about, close to family members, right? If this is a foster, right? And in a similar way, she's able to cut that data now and use that for her other clients, right? Hey, did you know this church? Did you know that you have X number of foster families that live within a 20-mile radius of your church that you could now network with?
Yeah.
That's the intelligent use of that data to provide really practical application. And while we aren't 100% sure how we're going to splice that data, it's the same concept. How can we take this in a way that benefits the folks who are using it and the organizations who are distributing it?
Wow. Rob, this has been an amazing conversation. I'm wondering, just as we're wrapping up here, I think most of the listeners of this podcast are probably more on like the digital ministry, side, evangelistic.
If I haven't bored them to death by yet, and they're still here.
Oh, not at all. Well, I'm always a fan of like, let's look at everything. I mean, I read stuff from all over the place, just to try to inform. But how might people from like church world, ministry context, is there an opportunity to engage with Trauma Free World, or what's that look like?
Yeah, actually on both sides. So the traditional training side, of course, if something piqued someone's interest, like, oh man, just understanding kids and having some trauma training, we have an incredible team that travels all over the world. We've trained people from over 80 countries, right? So we've got a training team. So if you're like, oh man, I want to do that online or whatever, fantastic. On the demonstration project side, however, that's really our next step, right? Do you have a ministry that focuses on foster or adoption? A lot of churches do, right? Youth ministry, right? Do you have volunteers and youth ministry that says, wow, especially in underserved populations, right? I work in the urban core or some other underserved population. A lot of the kids who are coming to our youth ministry, right? They come from these backgrounds, and I don't know specifically how to address them because I've never had any training in it. Well, now we can do a demonstration project together. You can try out, by the way, it's called TECO, Trauma Informed Care Coach on Demand. You can try TECO in a demonstration project. We're always looking for those kind of projects, 2 or 3 months in length. What'd you think? How did it work? How would you improve it? And did it help? Right? That's the ultimate question. Did it help you? Did you feel more confident? Do you feel more hopeful? Did it give you any self-care tools? And are you seeing a difference in the kids that you're working in? That's ultimately what we're about. I mean,
That's amazing.
why build it if it's not doing that?
Yeah. Well, you're building some great stuff. So thank you for the work that you do. Thanks for your team leading it well. And thanks for spending some time with me today.
Hey, Nick, thanks so much for the invite, and so glad that we found some time together in Atlanta, and now we're building on that time in this way too.